I'm going to walk through how I created a Zarr dataset from netcdf files using Dask Gateway. In this case, I had a lot of netcdf files in a Google Cloud bucket, and I wanted to create a copy of that as a Zarr database. Now this does duplicate the data, but I was trying to understand how to create these stores in the first place. Okay, so this will kind of walk through the logic that I used to do this. Each file took about 8 minutes to process. I had thousands, so I didn't want to do this in serial on a virtual machine. I wanted to use Dask Gateway and farm this out to a whole lot of workers. So in order to do that, I needed to create a template for the Zarr store and then write to that by time slices. Now, I needed to do this because if you were to write a Zarr serially, like by doing appending one file to the next, you couldn't do that in parallel. And I wanted to work in parallel because if I didn't, this would take weeks. So I want to create many workers and then have them all write one slice. Okay. So what are the steps to this? The first step is to create that Zarr store on a Google bucket. The next step is to create a function that's going to process the files and then and write them to your bucket, and then you have your function that starts up your Dask Gateway cluster. So this is a cluster of many different virtual machines. So let's see how this works. So first thing that I needed was to get the paths for the files that I'm going to be adding to this Zarr store. My Google bucket is public, so I could use token anonymous. At the end of this video, I'm going to talk about how to authenticate to private buckets because that was a real headache. But when I'm just reading, my bucket is public, so I can use token anonymous. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting up the file. I'm using the Google Cloud Storage FS package that is going to do the set up the communication. And when I have base here, this is the base to the cloud bucket. I'll show you an example. Okay. So here's an example, like if you were to go onto Google Cloud, and what you would see, if you could see the URL up here, it says console.cloud.google.com/storage browser, and then it's going to have this, which is the org name, and then these are the directories within that. So if we go back here, what your base is going to look like, you're going to see, if you're looking at your bucket, you're going to see this, and then everything after the browser is whatever the base is. So it's going to look like your org, directory 1, directory 2. And so this code is it's just looking at that bucket, and it's getting the file names here. That's all that's happening. Okay, and then reading those in. The chat bots are now really good at giving you this kind of code. So if you kind of tell them exactly what you want, you can show them like example code and say, hey, show me how to do this for my task. It'll get the bot on the right path. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is make this template. And so what you're doing is you're setting up a Zarr store. Let's take a look here. Okay, so here's my Zarr store, and so you see I have all these variables, and I have lat long time and some other coordinates here. And I need to kind of set this up, the structure of this, so that I can then go and then it will write into these chunks appropriately. Okay, so that's the first thing I need to do, is just kind of make it a blank version and put it up there, so then I can later write one time slice at a time. I had a really hard time figuring out how to do this. I found an example, and then I used a chatbot to help me out. So basically what I did is I printed out my X-array data set just using print, and then I gave the chatbot that information and then said, hey, show me how to make this template. And it is like, if your data set's complex, like mine had multiple variables, they had different kinds of structure. So some of them were like time, lat, long, others were time, depth, lat, long. So that's why the chatbot was really helpful in creating what I needed. But the basic idea here is that you create your, you kind of tell it where your Zarr is going to be located. Let's see here. So basically, here's the path to the bucket, and you're saying create that. And then what you do is you create the structure of this. So for each variable, I needed to say the variable name, what its shape was, what its chunking looks like. You can see up here what that chunking looks like. Okay. And then, yeah, going through all the variables. It's kind of tedious, but again, the chatbot did most of the work once I was able to tell it exactly what I needed. And then, I need to do my coordinates. Okay. And then in the next step, it fills all the coordinate values with something really small. In this case, I gave it just a little couple bytes. So I need to fill it up. And yeah. And then, so it's kind of interesting in this code that, where is this? Yeah, okay. So this part here is creating this root object. So it's creating that. And then later, as you add things to it, so I'll show you an example here. So like this, just doing root time, it's automatically putting that up in your Google bucket. So it is a little mysterious, I thought. But like I said, the chatbots are really good at this now. So if you show them my code, if you need to do something similar, you can say, adapt this for your case. Okay, so that's the first step. You need to make that template and you need to get that up into your Google bucket. So now that you have that template up there in your bucket, it doesn't have to be Google, whatever cloud storage you're using. Now you can start to write slices. I was writing time slices. You can write other types of slices. I was writing time slices. So what you want to do is create a function that's going to upload one slice. You need to create this function because you're going to pass that function to all your Dask Gateway workers. So here's what my function looks like. Okay, so if you're using Dask Gateway, it doesn't have access to your home directory. So that means that any files that it needs, you have to get it to them. And this is how I did it. So I read in the JSON that describes my credentials. So if you're using Google Cloud Buckets, this is where your credentials would be. How do you set up those credentials? Just Google that. There's great instructions online for how you do that. But once you have authenticated, you will see this file called this. That's your credential file. And so I read that JSON in, and then my function is using that JSON. When you're doing this, it's really important that you define this first so that your function is using that JSON. It's not a whole lot of text, so it was okay to just have it bundled as part of the function. So what does this function do? Well, the core of it is this part here. So first thing, it's going to read in my netcdf. I am reading from from a public bucket, so I can do this. See some notes here of how to set it up if you are reading from a private bucket. So I read that in. Unfortunately, I didn't like the chunking in my netcdf, so I had to change that chunking to something that was better. Better in that I wanted my chunks to be about 1 megabyte, no smaller than that. So that's, and my netcdfs, I just kind of messed it up and made these tiny little chunks. So I needed to change that. Okay, so that's the thing. I open up my netcdf file, and it's just pointing lazily. I didn't actually load the data. These netcdfs are way too big for me to be loading into memory. So it's pointing lazily to where the data are. So next step, I need to open up a pointer to my Zarr Store. So this is that template that I set up. So here, what I'm doing, I'm not going to write with this store. What I'm using this store for is to find the timestamps. So I want to match up the file that I just loaded here, its timestamp, with the timestamp in my Zarr. So make sure I'm writing data to the right timestamp. So that's what all this code is for. And like I said, my bucket is public, so I can use that. I added a little test to make sure that I hadn't uploaded the file again. It takes a long time to upload these. I don't want to be rewriting files. So this is something that worked for me. This particular thing would be all NA unless I had uploaded data. This particular variable will never be all NA. So that was an easy, quick test to see if there was data in the file. I wouldn't want to do something like checking is all the data NaN. That would take forever. That would not be a good test. So you need to be a little clever in how you test if the data have already been uploaded. Okay, so now I'm getting this dsday is the file I read in from my netcdf, but I need to drop variables that don't have time in them. So these all are variables that do not have time. So I need to drop those. So I drop those. And then next is the write part. So to write by time slice, I use this region thing. So I'm telling it which slice to write to, and I set up the time slice above where I talked about figuring out what timestamp is in the netcdf and matching that to the Zarr Store. So that was defined there. Okay, so a few kind of important things about this particular part where I'm writing. So I am going to be sending this to gateway workers. And what I want the workers to do is I want each worker, which is going to be like a CPU, one worker, and then it's going to have threads. I want each worker to grab a file and then do all its tasks in that worker. Now the problem is that my task, this task right here involves a Dask graph. So this, want to read these netcdfs in. Let's check this out here. Okay, You see when I open this data set, you see this chunks here. So this data set is chunked. It's massive. I can't be loading this whole thing in memory, so it's chunked. So I want to be working chunk by chunk, and this is telling it that. I happen to know what the chunking is, so I didn't need to be specific here. And then I re-chunk it to what I want from what's in the file. And here, when I do this, in the background, it recognizes that this is an X-array Dask array, that it's chunked, and it will set up a task graph to do this writing chunk by chunk, which is what I want, because if I didn't do that, the data is so massive, it would just blow up the memory. So I have to do it chunk by chunk. But if I don't do this right here, what it tries to do is spread that task graph across all my workers. And so it's trying to serialize, that means share this Dask graph across all my workers, and it's going to complain, I can't do that. So I need to tell it, don't do that. For this particular task, I want you to spread the Dask graph across the threads, not across different workers. So this is really, really important, and unfortunately the error that you'll see, it'll be like a serialization error. It's completely cryptic. You'll have no idea how to solve that. Okay, so one other piece I'd show you here. So now I'm writing to a bucket. So for writing this bucket, I have to give it my credentials. So it needs to know who I am, and then I have authority to be writing to this bucket. So what I would love to do, and what I could do if I were working locally, is that I would say the token is this right here. I could give it this credentials path. So what I'm doing with this code right here is I'm taking this JSON and I'm writing it to a temporary file. Because remember, my workers don't have access to my home directory. I'm going to have to write this JSON file into my worker so my worker has access to it. And so I'm writing it to a temp file here, and that's the path to that JSON file. And I would love it if I could say token cred path, just point to that file. But I found that my gateway workers kept giving me credentialing errors. And I think that's because when I work locally, that credential JSON file is within a .config gcloud directory, and it where is it? Oh, it's not loading here. The sort of the Google, the GCSFS package, or whatever else is being called for authentication, somehow it knows how to deal with that JSON file and how to refresh the token appropriately. My JSON is not a service worker. It's an authorized user token, and I just couldn't get it to work. But what I did was I did this instead. So I set this environment variable and I point that to the path, and that somehow triggered the Google authorization machinery to be able to read that JSON file. So that's what I had to do. And so I set that environment variable and I say use Google default. And what Google default does is it first tries to find the JSON file in your .config gcloud directory. If it doesn't find that, it looks for this environment variable, which I set. And so now it's finding it, and now somehow that is triggering it to know how to deal with that JSON. But somehow if I just gave it the JSON, it didn't know how to deal with it. So there you go. Spent a lot of time fixing that. Okay, so now I have this function that will will read in one netcdf and then write that time slice to the Zarr Store. So first thing is I just want to test it, make sure it actually works. So I take one of my paths and I run this. It takes about, see about 7 minutes, and you see it wrote it, and then I can read that in. This is how I read from my Zarr, and then I print it out. I just want to make sure it's not all NaN, and you can see it's okay. I tested it a few times. So I'm good. I feel like I'm good. Now I'm ready to send these tasks to all my workers. So first I'm going to tell it what the netcdf paths are. So this is my public bucket. I read that in, and I get the file names. So now paths is a list of all my netcdf file names. Okay. And I add on this GCS so it knows that it's in a Google Cloud bucket. So in this next part, I said make a function. I'm going to set up my Dask Gateway cluster. So it's you import Dask Gateway, and then you set your cluster options. So on the whatever machine you're on, how it's set up will determine what options you have. So what you want to do is, assuming you're on a hub, this is like on Kubernetes, where you have Dask Gateway set up, you're going to run this, and then you're going to run that, and then you're going to print this options, and you'll see what options you have. It's going to vary depending on how they have your system set up. So on mine, the default virtual machine, default worker that it sets up is 1 CPU and 7.5 gigabytes. There are much larger ones. By running one of these files here, I got a sense of how much GPU I don't need GPU for this. I need CPU. How much CPU, how much RAM I needed, and I didn't need much. So I went with the default, which is the smallest option. Actually, I didn't need that much, but that was the smallest. Okay, and then I tell it, say, hey, minimum of 4 workers, up to 20 workers. It spun up all 20, and now I get a client from that cluster. The client is going to do the work, and now here I dispatch my jobs. So here it's mapping my jobs out to all my workers. There's my one Zarr. And then there's the paths that I send it. And this is the main code that you're doing here. The rest of this is just making it a little fancier to print out the results. So if something fails, I see what fails. And this is all, rest of this is just kind of fluff to print things out. All right. So it took about 5 hours for this particular task. That was a whole lot better I was running 20 workers, so that was way better than just running it serially in my notebook. Okay, so it did take me quite a while to debug this, and so the major problems that I had were, first off, I had this serialization error that I could not get rid of. And, I was showing the error to the chat bots, and it just didn't help me at all. And so I finally, it took a long time to kind of like tell the chat bot, exactly what I was trying to do, and then tell it that I didn't like its 50 other solutions. And finally, I was able to tell it that I want this Dask graph to work on each worker and not be farmed out to the other ones. And once I was able to tell it that, it was able to give me the right solution. So that was really critical. Like I said, the error was so cryptic, could not figure out what the problem was. Okay, so that took a lot of time. Then the other thing was that I couldn't understand why my credentials were behaving differently on the gateway workers. So it's the exact same code. I could get it to run locally, but as soon as I farmed it out to a worker, it wouldn't. And I was giving it the credentials, the JSON text, and it just would give me a 401, so bad credentials. And I couldn't figure that out. And I'm still not 100% sure what's going on, but what the chatbot suggested was that authorized user credentials somehow work differently when you are doing that in a worker versus doing it in your locally. And it may be because locally I had this whole directory and that has some other information. And so when, I pointed it to the JSON path, but it kind of looked at that and recognized, this is Google Bucket. And so then it looked in this folder. Maybe that's what it was. Definitely on the Dask Gateway workers, they don't have this home directory config gcloud. And so somehow it just didn't know how to deal with that JSON file. Now the chatbot said if it was a service account key file, it would have operated differently than an authorized user JSON. I don't know. I don't have a service account key file. I just have my authorized user JSON. So what it suggested, and this ended up working, was to pass it token Google default and then set this environment variable in the file so that the worker gets that. So that ended up working. So I think it kind of triggered the Google auth that's operating in the background to recognize how to interpret that JSON file. All right, I hope that helps. I will post a link to this file in the description for this video.